They fought in silence, died in shadows, and the world almost forgot them despite their efforts in helping win World War II. Although they succeeded, these are the unspeakable things the Soviet women partisans suffered under the Nazi. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, it wasn't just armies that rose to fight. It was ordinary people. In forests, villages, and cities across the occupied East, a hidden war began. This was the world of the Soviet partisans. These were resistance fighters, men, women, and even teenagers who refused to accept defeat. Cut off from the Red Army, they fought behind enemy lines. They blew up train tracks, gathered intelligence, sabotaged supply lines, and attacked German convoys. And they did it knowing the risks: capture, torture, and death. Among them were thousands of women. Some had military training, others had none at all, but all of them chose to resist. They worked as couriers, nurses, spies, radio operators, and fighters. They climbed mountains, crossed rivers, and navigated through enemy territory, often under gunfire. In the early days of the war, many commanders doubted whether women should be sent into combat or on secret missions, but those doubts didn't last. Women like Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya and Tanya Baramzina became symbols of courage. They weren't just supporters, they were the mission, but the bravery of these women came at a terrible cost. The Nazi response to partisan activity was ruthless. Entire villages were burned, families were punished for helping fighters, and when women partisans were captured, what happened next was rarely written in official reports. Some stories survived in trial records, personal diaries, and the testimonies of survivors. Others were buried for years, too painful to speak about. While tragic, this is how the women partisans found themselves in that situation. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, and invaded the Soviet Union, millions of Soviet citizens found themselves behind enemy lines. But not everyone waited for liberation. Many chose to fight, not with full armies, but through resistance. These were the partisans, and among them were thousands of women. Most of these women were young, with some still in their teens. Many were students, teachers, nurses, and factory workers before the war. But when the Germans advanced, they either joined partisan groups already forming in forests and remote villages, or were sent in with special training by the Red Army or NKVD. Others became partisans after escaping Nazi roundups or after their families were killed. Some had lost everything and had nothing left but the will to fight. Their reasons varied. Some were driven by patriotism, others by revenge, and some wanted to protect their families. But once inside the partisan world, they became essential to the movement. Women served as scouts, saboteurs, medics, snipers, and couriers. They carried explosives across enemy lines, set mines on railway tracks, and gathered intelligence from occupied towns. They often traveled alone through dangerous territory, disguised as civilians, speaking in code, hiding maps in false bottom bags and messages in bread crusts. One of the most famous Soviet women partisans was Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, just 18 years old. However, on November 27, 1941, near the village of Petrushevo, west of Moscow, she was captured while on a sabotage mission. Even under torture, she refused to give up information, and for that, the Nazis subjected her to brutal treatment before executing her on November 29, 1941, by hanging her in front of villagers as a warning. Instead of her death-spreading fear, she became a national hero. Her story spread across the Soviet Union, inspiring thousands to join the resistance. Another well-known group was the Young Guard, a secret underground organization made up mostly of teenagers in the town of Krasnodon. Girls in the group helped distribute anti-Nazi leaflets, gathered weapons, and organized daring acts of sabotage. When they were discovered, they were arrested and brutally punished, but their legacy lived on. Tatiana Baramzina was another hero, a school teacher turned sniper. She fought in Belarus before being captured. According to Soviet records, she was tortured, but never gave away her comrades. She was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. These women were not just symbols, they were fighters. Their roles were dangerous, often more so than frontline combat, because capture almost always meant suffering. They had no backup, no reinforcements, only their courage and wits. By the end of the war, it's estimated that over 25,000 women served in Soviet partisan units. Many more supported the resistance in secret. Their bravery became a vital part of the Soviet war effort, a story of resistance told through silence, sabotage, and sacrifice. But it was not all roses. For Soviet women partisans, every mission came with the risk of capture. One mistake, one wrong move, or one person talking too much, that's all it took. The Nazi security forces were constantly watching, and they were ruthless when it came to hunting down resistance fighters. Women were often captured during sabotage missions while laying explosives on train lines or sneaking messages across borders. Others were taken in Nazi sweeps, massive security raids where entire villages were searched, questioned, and sometimes destroyed if suspected of supporting partisans. During these operations, anyone without proper documents or seen coming from the woods was instantly suspicious. But the Nazi soldiers were not the only problem. Betrayal was another common cause. In desperate times, some civilians were forced or pressured into giving information. Others cooperated willingly, hoping to save their own families. Even a small piece of information, a name, a meeting place, or a habit could lead to arrests. The Nazis became skilled at identifying partisans. They watched for muddy boots, toughened hands, and nervous behavior. Women suspected of being couriers or scouts were often interrogated on the spot. A woman traveling alone with no clear explanation or with maps, tools, or coded letters could be arrested immediately. Once captured, interrogation began quickly. Prisoners were often separated from male fighters and kept in isolation. The Germans believed women could be more easily broken and would give up information about underground networks, leaders, or missions, and so they made these interrogations intense. Women were questioned day and night, sometimes for weeks. Guards used psychological pressure, starvation, and sleep deprivation to try to extract information. Prisoners were warned that their families would suffer if they didn't talk. In some cases, fake news of comrades being killed or turning against them was used to break their spirit. After interrogation, those who still refused to cooperate were sent to detention centers, prison camps, or even directly to execution sites. Others were paraded through towns to send a message: this is what happens to partisans. Women were rarely treated according to military or prisoner of war rules. The Nazis didn't see them as soldiers. They saw them as criminals, saboteurs, and threats. That made their treatment especially harsh. According to documented cases, some were held in local jails under brutal conditions before being transferred to larger concentration camps like Ravensbrück, which held many female prisoners. One of the most haunting things was that there was no fair trial. The sentence was often decided in advance. But that's not all. Many Soviet partisans were executed in secret, their bodies buried in forests or mass graves. Others were sent to work in forced labor camps until they collapsed from exhaustion or illness. Sometimes even being suspected of helping partisans, not even being one, was enough to be arrested. Villagers who gave food, offered shelter, or passed along a message were also captured, including women, elderly people, and children. The Germans wanted to crush the resistance completely, and they didn't care who got hurt in the process. Despite all of this, many women never gave up their comrades' names. They held strong, even when it meant losing their lives. Their silence saved missions, protected entire networks, and allowed the resistance to fight another day. Being a woman partisan wasn't just dangerous. It was a sentence hanging over their heads every day. They lived in the shadows, knowing that if the Nazis ever found them, the consequences would be swift, cruel, and often final. For Soviet women partisans, capture by the Nazis was often just the beginning of a painful experience. Once in custody, they were subjected to a system of interrogation and mistreatment that was designed to break their spirit, extract information, and serve as a warning to others. What they endured was not only cruel but often calculated, part of a larger effort by the Nazi regime to dismantle the resistance movement in Eastern Europe. Most captured women were first brought to local jails, Gestapo offices, or field headquarters, where interrogations began immediately. These sessions were conducted without legal protection, often by experienced Nazi officers trained in coercion. The goal was simple: get names, locations, supply routes, and intelligence about upcoming partisan operations. Women were often placed in solitary confinement, deprived of sleep, food, and basic hygiene. They were interrogated repeatedly for days under intense psychological pressure. Loud shouting, verbal threats, and isolation were standard methods. Captives were frequently shown forged documents or false testimonies to convince them their comrades had already betrayed them. One common tactic involved threatening the well-being of their families. Prisoners were told their parents, children, or siblings would suffer unless they cooperated. In many cases, women were forced to listen to the mistreatment of others to make them believe their families were already in custody. These methods caused deep emotional distress and were highly effective in creating fear and confusion. In addition to psychological torment, women endured systematic humiliation and physical mistreatment. While each case differed, documented testimonies and post-war trials revealed a pattern of abuse. Interrogators would force women to stand for long hours, sometimes days, without rest. Others were tied in stress positions, denied food, or left exposed to the elements of nature. Beatings with batons, rubber hoses, or fists were commonly reported in in trial records and survivor accounts. A 1946 war crimes report from the Soviet Extraordinary State Commission described how female prisoners at certain Nazi facilities were stripped of all dignity. One woman, interrogated in occupied Belarus, was subjected to forced exposure to freezing temperatures, a method used to create extreme pain without leaving visible injuries. Others were placed in overcrowded, unsanitary cells, forced to share space with dozens of others, sometimes next to the dead or dying. At Ravensbrück, the largest Nazi concentration camp for women, many Soviet partisans ended up after initial interrogations. Here, abuse became routine. Survivors reported being forced to march barefoot for hours, carry heavy loads, or work long shifts in labor units under harsh supervision. Medical experiments were also carried out on some, particularly those labeled dangerous partisans. These included forced surgeries, exposure to diseases, and other procedures without consent. These methods used against women in Nazi custody were not random. They were part of a deliberate system of intimidation aimed at destroying morale and making examples out of the captured. The Nazis considered partisans bandits rather than lawful combatants, which meant they were denied protections under international laws. This classification gave German forces the perceived license to mistreat them without legal consequence. Many of these crimes were later documented during the Nuremberg trials and other post-war hearings. Survivors and witnesses gave detailed testimonies, and records from Nazi files confirmed the use of extreme measures against female prisoners. These included documented orders from commanders in occupied territories authorizing enhanced interrogation techniques. Despite all of this, countless Soviet women held their ground. Their silence protected entire networks and missions. Their endurance in the face of systematic humiliation and torment remains one of the most powerful and painful aspects of the partisan story, which motivated others to join them. After enduring brutal interrogations, many captured Soviet women partisans were not executed right away. Instead, they were loaded onto trains and transported to forced labor camps across the Reich. These women were considered dangerous, but they were also viewed as a resource to be exploited until their bodies gave out. Transport conditions were inhumane. Women were crammed into sealed cattle cars, often with no food, no water, and no toilets. The journey to camps could take days, sometimes a week or more. The sick were left lying on the floor, and to make matters worse, the dead were not removed until arrival. There was no air or light, and prisoners sometimes had to stand the entire trip. From there, it got worse. Once in the camps, they were assigned to work units with no concern for health or safety. Many were sent to labor in weapons factories, construction sites, or agriculture, performing tasks far beyond normal human limits. Others were forced to drag rocks, shovel snow for hours without coats or gloves, or clear debris from bombed-out areas. Workdays regularly stretched 12 to 16 hours, and refusal or failure meant severe beatings or death. On top of that, the camps were overcrowded and freezing in winter. Women slept 5 or 6 to a bunk, often without blankets. There was no heating, and the windows were broken. They were given thin, striped uniforms and wooden clogs, completely useless in the mud and snow. For this reason, many became sick almost immediately. To make matters worse, food was nearly non-existent. The daily ration would have been a crust of bread and thin soup with little to no nutrients, making starvation common. As a result, women collapsed during work shifts and were dragged away by guards. There was no rest, no days off, and no sympathy. Illnesses like dysentery, typhus, and tuberculosis swept through the camps. Since back then, medical care didn't exist, the sick were left to die. Guards pushed prisoners to work faster even when they were visibly wasting away. If a woman stumbled, she was beaten, and if she fell, others were forced to carry her and still finish the shift. But things got even worse. Punishments for slowing production included standing outside all night in sub-zero temperatures or being locked in tiny cells for days without food. At camps like Ravensbrück and Mauthausen, women partisans were placed in high-risk labor units intentionally. Nazi camp commanders saw their political resistance as a reason to break them physically, and for this reason, some were even assigned to quarry work, one of the deadliest tasks, where prisoners had to carry heavy stones up steep hills under constant abuse. As harsh as it was, this wasn't random cruelty, it was systemic. The goal wasn't just labor, it was to be destroyed. Nazi policy referred to it as extermination through work. These women weren't expected to survive. They were expected to be used up and discarded. Few women made it out of this system alive. Most passed away from hunger, illness, or exhaustion. Their deaths went unmarked, their names lost among transport lists or camp records. But some who survived later gave testimony, helping historians understand the full scope of what they endured and resisted in silence. When the war officially ended on September 2, 1945, thousands of Soviet investigators began collecting testimony and evidence about what had happened under Nazi occupation. The Extraordinary State Commission, established by the Soviet government, documented crimes committed across occupied territories, and among the most haunting were the stories of women partisans. These case files contain the voices of survivors, witnesses, and even captured Nazi officers. They paint a chilling picture, not of isolated violence, but of an organized system of cruelty. Tanya Baramzina is one of the most powerful examples. Having transitioned from a school teacher to a partisan, she joined the Red Army in 1943 and, after completing training, volunteered for dangerous frontline missions. However, Tanya was captured in 1944 while helping evacuate wounded soldiers. According to witnesses and Nazi documents, she was beaten and interrogated, then tied to a fence in front of a house and used for target practice by German soldiers. Before she died on July 5, 1944, near the village of Pekalin in the Smolyavichi region of Belarus, Tanya refused to reveal any military secrets. Another young fighter, Lyuba Makarova, was just 17 when she was arrested during a sabotage mission near Smolensk. Her captors held her for days, trying to force her to name other members of her unit. A fellow prisoner later testified that Lyuba was covered in bruises and barely able to stand, but she never spoke a word about her comrades. The Young Guard, a partisan group in Krasnodar made up mostly of teenagers, was betrayed in early 1943. Following the betrayal, over 70 members were arrested, including several girls. Survivors later described how they were tortured in a local jail for days. According to one investigator, the Germans pulled out fingernails and used electric wires during questioning. The captured partisans were eventually thrown into a coal mine shaft and buried alive. Testimonies collected by the Extraordinary State Commission were supported by physical evidence, written orders, reports from local Nazi command centers, and forensic analysis of execution sites. For example, in Belarus, investigators uncovered mass graves with signs of execution. A Nazi report found in Minsk confirmed the liquidation of female agents and saboteurs, listing names, dates, and reasons for their death. Captured German officers during post-war trials were also questioned about their roles. At the Nuremberg trials, officers admitted to issuing orders for special treatment of female fighters, a term that often meant immediate execution or extreme punishment. This is because, to the Germans, partisan women were more dangerous than the men. They were the messengers, the scouts, and the Nazi army was told to make examples of them. These files and testimonies weren't just stories, they were used as evidence to prosecute war crimes and to honor those who had resisted. Many women, including Tanya Baramzina, were posthumously awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the country's highest military honor. As graphic as each file was, it told a story of courage under pressure, since these women didn't just fight with weapons, they fought with silence, with defiance, and with loyalty to their cause. Their bravery was recorded not only in memory, but in thousands of pages of testimony, making sure the world would never forget. After Nazi Germany lost the war, the leaders were arrested, and at the Nuremberg trials of November 20th, 1945 to October 1st, 1946, crimes against partisans, including women, were part of the indictments. These Nazi leaders were charged with ordering the execution of civilians, the torture of prisoners, and the destruction of villages across the world. Evidence gathered from the Eastern Front, especially by the Soviet Extraordinary State Commission, was submitted to the tribunal. Reports listed specific atrocities: the burning of partisan villages, the forced labor of captured women, and orders to treat all partisans, male or female, as bandits without legal rights. Several high-ranking Nazi officers, including Alfred Rosenberg and Ernst Kaltenbrunner, were held responsible for crimes committed in the East. On top of that, testimonies from survivors in Soviet files detailed systematic violence against women partisans. However, many lower-level perpetrators escaped justice. Soldiers who carried out torture or executions were rarely identified. died. Some fled to the West, others returned quietly to civilian life in Germany. In many cases, victims' names were known, but not those of the men who mistreated them. In recent decades, historians and human rights groups have pushed to reopen investigations. Projects like the Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes in Germany continue to review old cases, though prosecutions remain rare. When World War II ended, many expected that the bravery of Soviet women partisans would be immediately honored. But the reality was far more complicated. For years, many survivors were met not with celebration, but with silence, suspicion, or even punishment. In Stalin's USSR, being captured by the enemy was seen as a sign of possible disloyalty. Women who had been imprisoned or held in Nazi custody were often viewed with mistrust. Some were interrogated again by Soviet authorities, accused of collaborating or not resisting hard enough. Others simply returned home and never spoke of what happened, fearing judgment or retribution. This silence lasted for decades. On top of that, official war histories rarely focused on the female partisans. Their suffering was not widely discussed, even in schools or museums. Only a few well-known figures like Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya or Tanya Baramzina were turned into state heroes, and even their stories were sometimes simplified for propaganda. However, recognition began slowly in the 1960s and 70s as books, films, and local memorials started to appear. Following this, Soviet newspapers published interviews with aging fighters. Some were finally awarded medals or included in veterans' events. Still, many stories stayed hidden. Families only learned the full truth decades later, through declassified files or personal diaries. Do you think the women partisans got the recognition they deserved, following what happened to them after being captured? Leave your thoughts in the comment section, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's wildest coverages.